Welcome to another episode of Electable. I'm Deb Chubb, and today we've got Tom Wallace with us, which is just a total treat because we've got lots of information to talk about today regarding the underground water contamination down in Morgan County. So Tom has been in Morgan County for centuries and continues to live down there. He's also a biochemist. Did I say that right?
No, I'm not a chemist.
Wait, you're
Environmental engineer.
Environmental engineer. Okay, sorry. So, and has been involved in the sciences, working at large, chemical labs and et cetera, for many years. And now, over the last 6 or 7 years, has taken on this issue down in Martinsville, which has, one of the highest cancer rates in the state. And he formed an organization called MISSA for short, but which is the Martinsville, Indiana Superfund Site Association. So several of the areas down there have been declared Superfund sites, and I think very difficult and persistent work. They are actually getting cleaned up. They've found the responsible parties. They've gotten money out of responsible parties to help with remediation or getting people hooked on to municipal water sources that are treated. They're not, clean out of the ground, but they're treated and safe. And so Tom, my goal is to not get too super sciencey that we lose our train of thought. And I know that you are all in this, and so this is just like the back of your hand now. But for the rest of us, we're still trying to figure this out. So I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more about, so you've done 4 projects so far. And so if we could just, kind of go through those 4 projects, because they're all super important, not only for their scientific integrity and the work that is being done, but for the community engagement that you have done and the environmental justice issues that you are working on from a long time ago and that you continue to work on. So Tom, can we start with the Showalter Children's Health Study and tell us, when that started and what you were testing for and how you tested and what you found?
Well, just real quick, the MISSA I started 6 years ago in response to the fact that we did have the highest cancer rate in Morgan County has the highest cancer rate in the state. And some rather unique cancers. And plus, most people have heard about the childhood cancers in Franklin, which is just 19 miles away. And it's the same chemical there as we have here. And then 3 years ago, Purdue University and I hooked up and made in a partnership, Purdue University Environmental Health Sciences. I did an initial study funded by Purdue looking at low-level exposures to PCE community-wide by taking a series of breath tests. Now, and water samples, including tap samples of water that had actually been treated, and air samples around town. Now, every PCE will accumulate in your system, and we can test how much is in your system by a breath test. So everyone we tested had a measurable amount of PCE in their system. So based upon this, we then went and looked at cancer rates, other concerns in the community, and then applied for a Showalter grant to study low-level long-term effects of PCE exposure for children ages 6 to 11, which we have just finished. The final analysis and reports of that are being done now. But what we did is we took breath tests of kids ages 6 to 11 to see what was the concentration of PCE in their system. If it showed up positive or exceeded any standard, we would then test their houses to try and identify where is the exposure originating from. Now we tested, we got participants from all over town, looking at control subjects as well, students that were living on one of the contaminated plumes in Martinsville, which there are 4, all which would be subject to vapor intrusion effects. And had a working relationship with Riley Children's Hospital, and they handled doing cognitive and neurological testing on iPads for all the kids, and they did behavioral assessments as well. So then we coordinate our behavioral and cognitive assessments along with exposure factors to look to see if there's any type of correlation between performance on the other tests and any type of potential exposure. So that's being finishing up now. And then reports will go back to the families and what the results were for the kids, and if there's any potential exposure in the houses, we would then look at getting remediation systems put in. The other project was the Superfund site in Martinsville was established solely because Martinsville's municipal water system was one of the most contaminated in the state. So all the public water in Martinsville was contaminated. And so that went on the national priorities list and then became a Superfund site. Now, since that happened, there was carbon treatment system put on to filter the water. And just in the last year, we've had 3 new water wells drilled, replacing the ones that have been there for nearly 100 years. That should have been replaced, almost 30 years ago. So that's been done. So the water quality is much better now than it has been in decades. So that aspect of exposure is pretty much eliminated at this point. But there was a period where the water was contaminated, where there was no treatment going on, apparently. So looking at a continuation of that, we did apply to Robert Wood Johnson to get a grant to look at groundwater contamination. And we went out and independently did testing of private water wells around Martinsville, in the plumes, outside the plumes, at various depths, 12 to 115 feet, to get a general view of what is water quality around the area, as well as at different depths within the aquifer. So that is still ongoing. There is another environmental justice aspect of that, looking at how does the community respond to knowing this? How has it affected you? Or has it affected you socially, economically, educationally? Because we do know that PCE does have a direct effect upon behavioral outcomes as well as neurological outcomes, which are ongoing. Once that happens, it is a lifetime effect. It's not going to go away. So that was part of that program. Then the Community-Based Participatory Research Academy is a program from the National Institute of Health to the University of Michigan. And they select 12 communities a year to participate in a year-long research program. And we were one of the 12 communities selected last year from across the country to participate in this. So we did that. And we looked at community engagement at the high school level, trying to develop a program with high school students to become more aware of what's happening in the community. If there's anyone interested in an environmental career or public service or public health at the high school level, an introduction to it. So we have a mobile testing lab that we took over to the high school. Science classes would come up. We run through them about how the testing labs work, what are the chemicals of concern, how the contamination happened, who were the responsible parties. And then we had some of the kids that would go out with us when we were actually doing testing in the field. They go out when we were doing ambient air testing or breath testing on individuals. How do we do the testing? How's the analysis done, as well as documentation? So that happened. Then we have an ongoing program we're working there. And then our fourth project, which is we're doing now on a startup, is another National Institute of Health project. It's a 5-year project. It's $2.8 million, looking at the same type of impacts on adults that we looked at the children. So we're looking at 300 participants, adults ages 18 to 64. We were doing breath tests to see the accumulation of factors, PC or TC in the systems, and then ambient air test in neighborhoods, indoor air testing to see if there is an exposure factor from vapor intrusion into houses. There are 3 universities working with us on this. Purdue University is doing environmental assessments, exposure assessments. Indiana University, Dr. David Kerrigan is heading up the team there that is doing the neurological and biological assessments on, or behavioral, not biological, assessments on the adults. Then University of Illinois at Chicago, Dr. Mary Turek is the cancer epidemiologist, and she's looking specifically at the cancer study. We know that the Indiana Cancer Consortium on their reports show that Morgan County has the highest cancer rate in the state. We have one of the highest cancer rates of lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer in the state. We do know that in Martinsville, we no longer have a hospital, but we have a major cancer treatment center in the town of 11,000 people. And 11 miles away in Mooresville, we have another comprehensive cancer treatment center. And that just indicates that, yes, someone somewhere has data to know that there is a market here for this. And we do know that from some of the cancer registries that there are about 2,300 people in Martinsville alone that go to this center in town, which is like 18% of the population. We know that certain people in town, like most GIS cancers in town, all go to one oncologist in Greenwood. Brain cancers and bone cancers, the patients are going to a doctor in Plainfield. Children's cancers are going to Riley or St. Jude's. And then there's some people who go to Bloomington. So we know there's a huge population in Martinsville supporting all the cancer treatment centers within our immediate radius. Now, Mary, Dr. Turek will be looking at the cancer registries to look at how do we determine if we can geolocate a lot of areas to see if there is certain other areas related directly to the contamination zones. So it's an interesting project. It's 5 years going on, and we have environmental justice elements built in there. Dr. Eve Pinkster, also with University of Illinois at Chicago, she's heading up an anthropological study with a series of focus groups. How has it impacted you? How do you feel not being known that you were exposed to this contamination for years? What do you want to do? So that's another aspect of it. Previously, we've had some students from Purdue put together an environmental justice video for an EPA project, which they did win an award on, and they are going on to a second tier of competition on that. So we are exploring more environmental justice elements here. But one of the big factors when we started this initially when I started this, was realizing that we're a small town, we're a small community, 11,000 people. We're living in a county that has the highest cancer rate in the state, and we're not alone. There are 50 some Superfund sites across the state. There are 86 coal ash pits. Indiana has.
I don't want to leave this topic yet, because I think this is. I don't want to that's a whole nother discussion. This coal ash lagoons, and don't get me started on lead. Oh my gosh. But this contamination, this particular contamination, comes from a plume of chemicals that contain some, just nasty cleaning solvents, and it has been underground in this area for 35 years. Is that right?
Well, the main one was a dry cleaning fluids. The first one actually started in 1964 when a company came here that started the first plume on the south side of town. And that's two plumes, the Harmon Becker and the Twiggs plume. And both of that are PCE, is the industrial solvents and cleaners that were just dumped outside. The Superfund site is interesting in that it was a dry cleaner right downtown, and there was an old dry well in the alley behind the building, and they were just pouring their fluids directly into this old dry well that went directly into the water table. Now, they were there for just 3 years. I think it was 1987 to 1991. Jeez. 3 years. And so here we are 30 some years later. The entire groundwater is contaminated because of that. The city municipal water system was contaminated because of that. There's been millions of dollars of public money to clean this up. And yet the responsible party, I think when the EPA went after them to get money to help the cleanup, they only got like $275,000. That was all there was there. So the rest of the money to do this cleanup is public money.
Right. And so,
So,
you know, we had that up, we actually had a case like that up here. I'm sure there are other places too from dry cleaners that did it. But you know, one of the differences between us and you is that we derive our drinking water from Lake Michigan, way out
Right.
there. So it would take a while for that, you know, whatever contaminant to even, you know, migrate, and we can stop it from migrating into the lake from where we get our water. But where you are, you get your drinking water from wells. You dig it out of the aquifers.
Right.
And these contaminants, you know, aquifers are, you know, tricky things. They're not, you know, it's not a sealed container under the ground. You know, water migrates back and forth between aquifers at different levels under the ground. And so it's a much more difficult, I think. And in my opinion, I'm always very skeptical of these plume maps, because you're like, well, do you really know, you know, really where this chemical is? You pointed out earlier in our conversation that the plumes that are on the map, you know, there's several of them around Martinsville, but then there's all this space in between that doesn't seem to be included in the plume map. But clearly they are impacted as well. And it will be a real struggle, though, I think, to, you know, get funds to, you know, test them and see what's in there. I know that you said you were testing inside and outside those indicated areas of contamination under the ground. Is that right?
Yeah, because I mean, the principal public health issue now is the vapor intrusion, just like radon.
Right.
The
So
vapor,
just to explain that, it comes up, you know, just kind of, you know, because it's lighter than the dirt that it sits in, it comes up and it can seep into this vapor can seep up into your house, right?
that's right, especially if you have a dirt basement or if you have cracked concrete in the floors and everything. Uh, the vapors will come in, they will accumulate in the house. So you have a greater exposure just to concentrated accumulation. In the EPA side, the EPA did identify 300 properties that they felt would be potentially contaminated by vapor intrusion. A big issue is where the public is getting people's trust to be able to test the houses to see if you've been impacted or not. So we have worked with the EPA on that and did canvassing door to door with the Citizens Action Coalition, and Bryce Gutherson was a huge help on that.
Awesome.
And finally got permission to test 80 houses, 80 properties within the Superfund site area for vapor intrusion. And out of those 80, 25% of them exceeded the standard that did require a remediation system. So if we were extrapolate that one out, you know, we're looking at, you know, a substantial number of houses within and an impacted community, number of people within that very small Superfund site area. Now, the best thing about that is once these houses were determined to need a vapor intrusion system or remediation, the EPA will pay for that. So right now, the systems are being installed even as we speak. They're going on now. The cost of that, which is being picked up by the EPA, is anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000. So it's per house, per structure. So, you know, that it's good. You're eliminating liability. You're taking care of the problem. Plus, it's a value-added feature. If you wanted to sell your property, it's just like a radon system. It's another value-added feature to add onto your property.
Right.
So,
and that remediation is sealing the foundation and basement. Is that it?
Well, that's what the EPA is doing. If you, for example, you have a dirt floor, even a crawl space, which some of the older houses do have, they'll cover, encapsulate the dirt, seal the foundation all the way around, caulking and everything to make it airtight all the way around, plus put in the vapor intrusion system, the exhaust system. There's a little motor on there and a fan, which uses electricity, which you will then have to pay for. So you'll have an increased electric bill. But it was estimated that running that was about $7 a month for the electrical cost.
And that fan is running forever?
Yes. And they will replace the fans if they need to be replaced later on. That will run during the entire remediation system.
So, and tell me what the fans do. What's the?
It's an exhaust fan, just like on the radon system. It's an exhaust fan that extracts any vapors that might accumulated out into a tube that runs up the side of the house and exhausts it above the roof line.
I see. And so that fan is located in basement or crawl space, or it's located in the house?
Most of them are outside along the wall at the exit
I
point.
I see. Interesting. Okay, good. And so, just to be clear, I mean, when we talk about responsible parties here, these dry cleaning places we know are, the culprit. But are there other responsible parties as well?
Uh, well, yeah, whoever the manufacturing unit is, Harmon, Becker, and Twiggs were responsible parties for the other two. There was another dry cleaner in town. This one is kind of interesting. They were actually just pouring their chemicals into the sewer, which would have gone straight down the sewer line to the treatment plant, sanitation treatment plant.
Mm-hmm.
Except for one little thing, and this is another thing that comes up, which we have to be aware of, is your municipal city infrastructures. About a half block away, the sewer lines have been fractured and have been for apparently years, so much so that they had already leaked and carved a water channel out all the way down one of the main streets in town. So when these chemicals hit that break, they went right out into a flowing channel. So this one actually happened because of faulty city infrastructure. And so that went virtually all the way downtown. They did at one point commingle with the Superfund site. Interesting enough, for some reason, the operator there, they had this very good insurance policy. So their insurance picked up to pay for the entire cleanup.
Oh, well, nice.
And that site is the only one in town that is currently under full remediation. So in about 18 months, that one can be taken clear of. They're putting in 4 barriers using a proprietary chemical called plume stop, a different process that the EPA does not recognize and use here. Even though we tried to get them to use that here, but it's being used there rather effectively, and they will have this one cleaned up in about 18 months. So, and then they also had vapor intrusion testing for houses along there that might have been affected. So they were very progressive. That was a very good example of how to take care of these issues. So that one's coming along very, very nicely. But the other 3 in town aren't. The EPA site's been going on since the 80s. It was classified as Superfund site, I think, in 2013. The other 2 sites are voluntary cleanups with oversight from IDEM, and they've been going on for decades. We just need more action on those 2 to maybe get them into a mandatory state-directed program instead of voluntary program.
And those sites that are under voluntary remediation, what are those sites? I mean, above the ground, what's there?
One of them is aerospace parts manufacturing, but the chemicals that were there are essentially the same thing: trike, PCE, cleaning solvents and such, and some vinyl chloride. Another element that we did find in some testing around was boron and lithium in some water tests that we found. So these toxic chemicals can be ingested either by breathing the vapor or drinking the water that's contaminated, right? Right.
Okay.
Currently, mainly it's breath at this point.
Mainly it's what?
Inhalation, breathing.
Inhalation, right. With other, lead's the same thing. It's the most dangerous way to ingest lead is through inhalation. It's more terrible. And so so I want to go back to the cases of cancer. So you all there had you said the highest cancer rate. You actually had these cancer clusters of very rare cancers. Is that right?
Who did?
Your area had these cancer clusters. I mean, I don't know if that was the trigger. I mean, I've been hearing about this contamination for years. And I've heard for a long time too about the cancer clusters in that area. And maybe that was Franklin, but down there, and it was really kind of just odd, very rare cancers that were being detected. And so are you following? I mean, you had mentioned about all the cancer treatment centers out there, and I assume perhaps this more, I don't know, it's not exactly longitudinal, but this new study, the 5-year study, that's going to really look at those cancer cases and, I mean, really chart them out. I mean, I was shocked that that hadn't been done already. You mentioned that last project.
Well, yeah, most people are shocked anyway how all this even happens, and how it's even allowed to happen.
Yeah,
And that's part of our community engagement is, well, how did this happen? Why didn't we know about it? Do we feel betrayed? On and on and on. So there's a lot of emotional issues when you get into this. Now, cancer clusters, there really hasn't been a designated cancer cluster here. Cancer clusters have caused a lot of problems. That happened over in Franklin because of childhood cancers, but the way they defined a cancer cluster made it virtually impossible to have an area defined as such, because it virtually had to be an identical cancer repeatedly.
I see.
Whereas cancers are not necessarily identical. You could have, like in Franklin, you have a lot of childhood cancers. The source point, the contamination exposure was the same, but they will manifest individually and uniquely to the person. And consequently, you can't call it a cluster. They did change that. That was changed so that the definition of a cancer cluster has been changed. So it's easier to do that now. But you do have, like here, we find a GIST cancer, which is generally older men. We do have like an area where we know, like in this one little neighborhood, there's like 5 people within short distance. And it is a fairly rare cancer anyway. But one of the more unique things, we did have a woman who was diagnosed with GIST here in her 30s during her 3rd trimester.
Oh, geez.
So that was an anomaly.
Yeah, that does sound like an anomaly. So tell me what GIST is. Can you explain
It's
that a little more?
gastrointestinal sarcoma cancer.
Okay.
Tumor.
I see.
And it is treatable. One of my good friends in town here, he was one of the patients, and he's been treated for years. At one point he lost over 40 pounds. He's younger than me. But it can be treated, but once you have it, it affects you for your whole life, and your life's never going to be the same again, just like with most cancers. So the social and economic impacts and the family impacts are you cannot really calculate the value of that. When cancer hits you like this.
Right. Well, yeah, lost wages and, all of those other kind of tertiary impacts. And so I wanted to
caregiving. You could move right on to caregiving, because over now, your family has to pick up now another responsibility.
That's right. Right. And so we had talked earlier too about other kind of tertiary impacts, and you'll be studying those too. That is impact on academic achievement and behavior issues that show up in terms of high school dropouts. As you had mentioned, you have 17% high school dropout rate there in Martinsville. And I know when I was doing a lot of work with lead, there were those sorts of correlations, being really confirmed with those kinds of contaminants that, impact brain development and young children, and behavioral issues, and then ultimately crime rates in the area. And there was actually a really terrific longitudinal study watching 2 young boys, one who grew up in a good area, with no contamination, one who grew up in an area contaminated by lead. And, and it was really, it was a great study because it really told the story of these 2 kids and how their lives diverged. And one ended up, of course, in prison, and the other one, did not, and ended up being successful. But is this study that you're doing going to be looking at those sorts of, those sorts of impacts as well?
Yeah, that's the one thing I'm hoping we're going to be looking at through our more anthropological study. There's a lot of work being done in Indiana. That Indiana University just finished one on lead exposure, directly correlating it to juvenile delinquency because of the behavioral effects. We do know that these exposures affect behavior. They have neurological consequences. When we look at high school dropout rates, if we look at community special needs children in the high schools or in the schools or in the communities. I know I was at one event here and there were 8 Down syndromes kids in this small town at one event, which seems like, well, we seem to have a higher rate of Down syndromes here. That was a shocking thing for me because I never thought about that. I walk in and there's, a room full of kids here with Down syndrome. Why is that? And they're all in this fairly localized area. So right. When you see things like this, it makes you question what's going on here. And like you mentioned, crime rate. We start looking at contaminated sites that have these chemicals, and we do social overlays, like what is the crime rate in this neighborhood when we know that you have exposures to these chemicals that do affect people behaviorally as well as neurologically, so they are not cognitively equipped to do any conscious equivalency of how of their actions.
Right, and that's what we were talking about before too. That the neurological effect really inhibits, kids' ability to, control their anger, to manage their behavior. It's not that they're bad people; it's that this contamination does impact their ability to manage themselves, and it affects their executive function part of the brain that really makes people stop and make a plan and think it through. And so it's a lot of impulse problems. And that's what really translates into the high crime rate.
Yeah, we look at our incarceration rate and the type of people that are being incarcerated. So many of them are neurologically or behaviorally impacted. And if we start looking at their backgrounds and such, we'll find that these kids never had a chance to start with.
Right. Well, and I wonder if that would be another interesting study to really, study the people in prison.
No, that is another thing I've talked about when we're looking at this or doing overlays that we have of data, looking at crime rates specific to a zone that we've identified that is a Superfund site or a contaminated zone. We know what the exposure factors there. Okay, there are going to be people affected with this behaviorally and neurologically. What are the outcomes? How can we identify and see if this is true? We'll overlay on top of that crime rates. Overlay of that on top of that of poverty rates, school dropout rates, all in this, and you'll start seeing a pattern develop.
Right. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about the EPA performance? It tends to change from presidential administration to another, and I wonder what your opinion is. I've worked up here, on lead a lot, and I could tell you, don't get me started. But so how do you feel about the EPA performance there on this project?
Well, like the key word that you mentioned was presidential administrations. They changed the color of virtually everything. In the last one, there were Superfund sites in Indiana that were delisted. Regulatory ability to do any type of enforcement has been virtually stripped away. IDEM has virtually no enforcement capabilities at all. A lot of some of the issues that we have here in Martinsville, you would think the EPA would have authority over, they don't. For example, right down at the ground zero of the Superfund site, we have vapor intrusion problems. Yet we have a construction site going on where they're excavating 15 to 20 feet into the ground there, right into the VADOS zone that is contaminated, where you can see it's probably ambient air is being, the chemicals gassing out in a more concentrated form directly into this neighborhood. You can't do anything about it.
Wow. Well, and it made me, when you mentioned too that one of the sites that's, been kind of a lackadaisical EPA cleanup includes a manufacturing building on top. And I'm wondering if they're monitoring the air quality in there for employees. I mean, is
well,
there
that's an OSHA element, employee health, and Indiana again is another issue. They've been defunded to such a degree,
right.
You just don't have the option anymore.
Right. Many of those places are, self-monitored, so it's just
self-monitored. Yes.
Right. OSHA does not show up and test. They just count on the owner of the business to do it themselves.
You know, like, for example, underground tanks. I know there are underground tanks that were closed here in Martinsville with no inspections. It's just what the owner said. We don't even know if they were emptied out
Or if they leaked.
or if
Yeah.
they leaked, nothing. So, yeah. But I think that getting back specifically to the EPA here in Martinsville, we have had a very constructive, dialogue with them. Very friendly, very open. Eric Hardin, who is the project director, and Kirsten Sakopoulos, who is the community coordinator. I don't think you could have gotten any better ones for communication, openness. When we have questions or we need something, they've always been available. But again, they're constrained with what they can do.
Right.
They're constrained with types of enforcement. There are no institutional or industrial controls on these sites that might prevent anything from the future happening, just like this excavation. There should have been, historically in the past, there were institutional controls that would have prevented that type of excavation and that potential exposure until the site was fully characterized and remediated. That no longer exists. At one time it did. But given
is that an EPA decision, you think, or is that an IDEM decision?
Well, it's a legislative decision in Indiana on a lot of issues.
Yes. So, and have you seen a difference, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on the federal level? I mean, EPA directly?
Well, I think it's really too soon to see any, the outcome of any changes at this point. Particularly for us, because we're entrenched already into a type of program, and whether, well, I know one thing that did happen that did affect us immediately was during the last administration, in order to try and curtail certain sites and government expenditures, they made it so complicated, the paperwork to get something through, that it actually quadrupled the cost.
Oh, geez.
So I have heard that happen just, in the last administration. So and there was also at that time where some other sites were delisted from Superfund site, my site list, which might be because of the excessive paperwork that was put in specifically to stop any type of environmental action. It wasn't to help public health or anything, it was just to stop it. So that still has not been changed. But going back to just our situation here, the EPA, I think, has been really proactive and very helpful with us. When the city of Martinsville did hire a consultant to work directly with them and the EPA, we were back and forth all the time, talking about what type of remediation, what was the best system to do it, cost effectiveness, looking at time. Time is a big issue. The current plan, the RADA decision to remediate the Superfund site, once it starts, which will not start probably until 2024, it'll still take 17 years minimum.
Oh, wow.
To do the contamination using the accepted EPA technology. Now, the other site that I mentioned that is going to be cleaned up in 18 months here, the technology that they're using was actually used in Franklin during their emergency cleanup in Franklin, but they won't use it here because they do not acknowledge its technology yet, even though it's proven to be more efficient and perhaps more cost effective. But it has not been technically acknowledged as being an approved EPA system.
Well, there's a lot of, there are a lot of problems with that EPA, looking at those kind of technologies, as well as looking at new contaminants. I mean, we know that's a problem too, getting them on the toxic substance list, is difficult too. That's what happened with PFAS, that they were, they just weren't on the list. So they weren't illegal. They weren't regulated because they were.
There's a lot of stuff that's still not regulated. It should be.
Right.
But one of the issues I would like to really bring up when we're talking about this is when you're working with EP and stuff, and you run into this, which is like a dead end, essentially, you're in a position where the knowledge that we now have and the research, we can actually start to try and implement changes, which you couldn't do before. So you have a greater voice, you have a greater ability to say, well, here, this is what it is. This is what we know, whether the detriments, it could be better if it was this way. So we have a format, we have a vehicle and an avenue to take this forward, to move it forward finally, which we never had before.
Excellent. Well, that's delightful. God. Okay, so so we're running out of time, Tom, and I'm sure I could talk to you forever, and you could educate us forever. But I just want to say how grateful I am that you're here in Indiana, and I'm sure that your community is super grateful that you are there in Morgan County. What a lifetime of work. I know you're retired, and thank goodness you're there. That's all I can say. So, and I'm sure you'll continue doing all this work, and I would love to come back and talk more as we move along, because these studies are great, but they are just not terribly accessible to the general public. It's hard to figure out where they are. It's hard to read them. It's hard to understand them. It's hard to really evaluate them as to what actually happened, what actually was found, how is it how is it impacting people, and what are we doing to fix it, and how long will we continue to study it. But I think I would love to keep that question alive with you and with everything you're doing, is how long will we continue to monitor? Because that always worries me, that even on Superfund sites, that they'll come in and dig up some topsoil or put some vents in, and then that's it. And I hope that question of how long can we continue to monitor this problem and these people who are impacted stays alive, that people continue to talk about ongoing monitoring, because I think that is the one thing that kind of gets lost a lot. So, all right. So, Tom, any final words of wisdom for us before we go?
Just one thing, people need to start taking more attention to what's going on in their own backyards, realizing they do have options, that there are people here trying to help you. We want to these can be very emotional issues, but our emotionality has to be channeled in a fashion that will make it really constructive. We're using that energy to move forward. And you just got to start thinking in a clearer, more concise fashion. And if you're going to kick ass in this country, to do it.
Yes. So, well, that's great. Those are very wise words. And I know there's people like you who are trying to make it more accessible, because I think, all my work in environmental issues, that was something I really focused on, was how can we make this accessible to people so they understand what's happening, an accurate characterization of what's happening, as well as something that they can, repeat. They don't have to go back to some, giant textbook to try to figure out what it was. So
yeah, we're not alone in this. There's a whole lot of us out here that they're doing this.
Good. Yes, and I know that you've got a good team down there, and thank goodness. And all the great universities, Purdue, IU, University of Illinois at Chicago, great universities all pitching in. And I'm, of course, really excited to hear that you're working with the local public schools, the high schools, and getting those kids involved. Do you feel like those kids are engaged, and they're going to be taking this issue on?
Some of them, yes. And, I graduated to Martinsville High School, and I know when I was here, I would love to have done something like this, So maybe it's like I'm recreating my childhood by doing this.
Well, let's hope you're changing someone else's childhood and putting them on a path, like yours, to really be helping this community.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. We should do it again sometime.
Absolutely. I'll be back, and because I'll want to know, the updates and hear the results of new studies that are finished as they come along. And I look forward to it.
Great. Thanks.